Hi, I'm Rachel with Patterns and Pixels Canada, and on today's video, I finally finished quilting and binding my half square triangle baby quilt. I've gotten my quilt ready and prepared to start quilting it, but I wanted to show you what I have done before I start that process. So the first thing that I did was take the backing fabric that I purchased and I stitched it together down the center so that I would have a vertical seam. It works better with the print that I chose to have a vertical seam rather than a horizontal. It was just the right size without the seam, but for those of you that have quilted before, you know that sometimes things can shift while you're quilting, and I prefer to have a very large amount of fabric left around the outside edge, just in case things move more than they should. If I was quilting a much larger quilt, a bed-sized quilt, I would have used sort of a spray adhesive as well as pins to layer my pieces together. Because this one is so small, I was fine just pinning it together. And I chose where to put my pins based on the quilting design that I've chosen to use for this quilt, which I'll show you in a minute. In terms of the batting, I used something fairly thin. I have done quilts in the past where I've doubled up the batting to get it really thick and puffy when I quilt it. For this particular one piece is fine. Sometimes if I'm doing something like a table runner, I'll make it even thinner, or not even use batting. Sometimes I use like a sheet or something inside, because with a table runner, you want to be able to put your dishes or your decorations, your candles, your centerpieces on top without them sort of tipping on the bumpiness of the quilt. So you want something that doesn't have that much plushness to it. Whereas with other projects that you do, you want to have that. For this particular project, I did pick a flannel for the back. And the reason why I chose a flannel is because this is going to be a baby quilt. And as you know, you don't actually put the quilt in the crib with the baby. So most people end up using baby quilts as coverings on the floor while the child's having tummy time or playing with toys or things like that. And so I like it to be something soft that they can sit on. I also tend to choose backings that not only work with the front, but I also feel might give the quilt some longevity. I chose this backing because of the gray and the golds and the yellows, which worked with the front. But I also chose this image because I felt like it would last longer for the child. Whereas if I had picked something very cutesy, you know, teddy bears and things like that, that might just suit a really young child, I then have this fear that the quilt ends up getting put into like a keepsake box somewhere and never touched again. And personally, I feel like a child's quilt is meant to be used. It's not meant to be something that is looked at and never touched, because you're giving it to a child. They're supposed to play with things and get things dirty and messy, and things are going to happen on this quilt. I'm well aware of that. And I would rather pick a backing fabric that means as the child grows, this will be something that they drag with them to the couch when they go to watch a movie, or it goes into the car with them when they're going on a camping trip, and is something that just lasts a little bit longer. They can get more use out of it. So I pick a backing fabric. It's still fairly young, you know, clouds and suns and moons and everything, but I feel like it'll last them a little bit longer than if I had picked something really designed for a baby. Now that I've got the backing, the batting, and my quilt flimsy on here and pinned, I now need to do the actual quilting process. So to do that, I need to first pick the thread color that I'm going to use, and I also need to pick my design. I have done both of those things already, and I will show you momentarily what I have decided to do. for the quilting design, I'm going to do one separate design just inside that square. And then the rest of the quilt is going to be quilted in one pattern. I do not have a long arm quilting machine, so I do use my Juki to do my quilting. I have quilted baby size quilts before on it and it has been fine. It does get a little tight under the arm, but I can do it. I haven't quilted any bed size quilts on it yet. I don't know if I'm going to try it. I know you have the option of sending your quilts out to be quilted by people who have long arm quilting machines. I prefer to do the entire process myself from beginning to end, and I would rather be able to get my quilts into my Juki machine. A long arm quilting machine might be something that I get in the future, but for those of you that are in the business, you know how expensive they can be. So there'll be a lot of saving up before I get one of those. Let's take this over to the table now, and I will talk about thread choices and the quilting design that I've chosen to do. Before I start quilting, I need to decide what thread colors I would like to use in the quilting. And this is entirely based on your preference. If you want high contrast so that your quilting shows, or low contrast so that it blends in. So what I do is go into my stash and take a look at what I have available. So the first one I picked out was this yellow variegated, sort of yellows and oranges. And I thought I'd start with that. Now I think it would look perfect on my yellows, but I felt that it was showing just a bit more than I really wanted to have on my grays. I did also have this darker one, but it was one of those ones that as soon as I took it out, I knew it wasn't going to work. Again, it would be fine on my yellows and oranges, but it was going to show more on my grays than I really wanted it to. So I then went into my grays and thought, okay, well, what happens if I do that? But of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, as soon as I select one of these ones, the lighter one especially will work lovely with the grays, but then it's going to show quite a bit on the oranges. And what you can see that I'm doing is as I'm pulling out just one strand to see what it's going to look like on my, my different fabrics. So as soon as I picked out the lighter one, I knew it was going to be showing far too much on my oranges, so I didn't even bother with the other two. So I then moved into my lighter whites and creams. And funny enough, I tend to do most of my quilting with sort of this color palette because it doesn't seem to matter what fabric I choose, it doesn't show, which is lovely. Now, obviously you'll have some quilts that you do where you want it to show. So then that's where you think about your high contrast. So this is my lightest, almost a white. Then we start moving into creams, which yes, they all will show on the yellows more than they will on the gray. Oh, this one's stuck. Oh, there we go. So with it spread out like this, let me see if I can just zoom in on that a little bit for you so that you can see. So here with a bit of a closer view, I feel like the white is just too bright against my oranges, although it would be fine on the grays. So I'm going to take that one out of the options. Then looking at the three I have remaining, this one is now reading to me as having like a pink tinge to it, which is just showing up far too much on the grays. So I'm going to take that one out. Then what I've got here, sort of a cream, and now see this one I think is reading a bit too brown almost. So I'm going to take that one out, which leaves me with our winner. I think I'll use this one, which is number 22. And it's not too bad against the oranges. It shows up more on this one than it does on this one because of the busyness of the pattern. Let's just check it up here. Yeah, it shows up a little bit more there, but then on the one over here in the top corner, we do have white in that pattern, so it doesn't show on there, but it does on the little bit of the darker oranges. I think it works perfectly with the grays. So yeah, that's the one I'm going to use. I'm going to use 22 for this quilt. Okay, now that I've chosen my thread, I've chosen to use 22. Next job is to decide what I'm going to do in my quilt itself. The first thing I wanted to show you was what I've decided to do for this center block, and that will be this. Now, this image was something that was shown to me by a guild member, and I thought, perfect, I can try that in my square. Now, because I've never quilted this before, I did a test run to see if I could manage it, and I bet you can tell which square I did first. So this is the one I did first, and quickly realized that the gap I had left was far too large. Nice image, but it's not going to lead into making this pattern. So I did this square second, and believe it or not, if I just come up close here, this entire quilting pattern was done with my walking foot. These are all straight lines. And all you do is you go from one corner to the other and just rock around and around and around, and you end up with this fantastic image. The tricky bit is then figuring out how to quilt it on the next grid, so that way you end up with this swoop. I did struggle trying to figure that out, so what I ended up doing was taking a picture of just that square, and I used my phone to flip the image until I figured out which way I needed to quilt it here to get it to match. And then you keep going around, and obviously if I had quilted this one properly to begin with, there would have been a mirror image on this side. The reason why I wanted to show you this is because if you are trying something new, a quilting pattern that you haven't done before, I highly recommend practicing first before you do it on the real thing. So this will be what I put into that square there. Then for the remainder of the quilt, I am more confident with walking feet than I am with free motion quilting. So I like to use my book here by Melissa Marginet, and I have decided that I'm going to do the hourglass pattern. Now I could just go one direction and be finished, but I like the way this one looks. So I'm going to quilt going down, and then I'm going to come back, step number 2 here, across, and end up with this design. And I'll just skip over doing the square, and I'll do this design everywhere else on the quilt. I don't know yet whether or not I'm going to add in that additional line here to make it cross-hatched. I'm going to wait and see what it looks like once I've made this. And then if I decide I need to have a little extra, then I'll go back and add that into it. The way I'm going to handle quilting this is I'm going to do the center block first. Then I'm going to probably lay my quilt back out on the floor so I can put in the markings that I need to create this image. Especially with the lines I have on here, I don't want to accidentally follow this line because that's not the shape that we have here. I need to divide each of my sides into thirds. So that way I would come from this point down to here and this point to here. And if I don't have little marker lines there, I might inadvertently start following the pattern that I have. And that's also why I chose to put my pins in the corners, because I knew I was going to do this quilting design and it doesn't touch the corners. And I thought, perfect, I'll be able to quilt without having to move any of my pins. And while I'm talking about the pins, let me show you the ones that I like to use. They have, I wonder if I can do this, you'll be able to see a little bit better. There we go. They have a little bend to them, which is perfect for pinning together groups of fabric, because when I have this laid out on the floor, I'm able to rock the pin along that curved edge and get all 3 layers. When I first started quilting, I did just use my normal straight pins. And the problem that I found with these is that as I have the quilt laid out flat on the floor, I'd go through what I thought was all 3 layers with my straight pin, only to then pick the quilt up off the floor and realize that I hadn't actually grabbed through to the backing each time. So I eventually purchased these pins instead. Hello, Salsa. And have found those to work much better. Thank you, sweetheart. She's so sweet sitting with me. I think we're ready to start quilting now. So we'll move over to the sewing machine. Before I can start doing my quilting for today, I need to switch out my standard foot for my larger walking foot. I have a Juki machine, so I've purchased a walking foot that will fit onto my machine. They're quite big and clunky, but they are very useful as far as I'm concerned. So with my machine, I'm able to open this front drawer and take out this handy little key, which does all sorts on my machine. I need to start first by taking off this pin. If I was just to take off the foot, which I do if I'm changing to other feet that allow me to use different stitches, this one wouldn't fit because it comes with such a big casing on the back. So I'm actually going to leave this attached. This is the foot I use most often, and so I just tend to leave the whole thing together. I need to loosen this screw so that I can take off, let's put that down there so it doesn't roll away. So I can take off the whole piece. And then when I come to put this one on, that space there will be where my screw fits into. This bit needs to rest on here. So I'm going to come from behind and just use my finger to lift that up so that it sits on that bar, just rests there. Then I'll use my finger to get this screw started. And finish it off with the key. Okay, my walking foot is on now. I don't need to change any of the settings with my machine. I will, however, make sure this goes right back into my drawer, and that goes back into my drawer before I put them down somewhere and forget where I've put them. Now I'm ready to start quilting. So to fit my quilt underneath my machine, I just need to roll up the side that's going to be fitting under the arm. I'm at the top of the quilt right now, so this roll isn't too big. Once I get further down, it's going to end up filling the space. But as long as I've heavily pinned what I'm working on so nothing shifts, I'm able to work in this space, in this zone, knowing that everything will be sitting the way they need to. Again, like I said, I'm going to start with the center square on this quilt. Whatever quilt I am working on, I do like to start in the center and work my way out. That way it reduces the amount of shifting I might have with my backing fabric. So I'll get this done first, and then we'll start quilting the rest of the quilt more from this position coming out. Okay, the quilting is finished. But you can't see it. It shows up quite nicely on the back. If I just flip this over. You can see it a lot clearer on the back, and that's because my bobbin thread was cream. And obviously the flannel on the back has a lot of gray to it, so it shows it quite nicely. Problem becomes, though, of course, the front, where I had chosen to use the cream as well, because I didn't want high contrast in the quilt. I just wanted it to have sort of a subtle look to it, which is all well and good when you're doing something like the simple hourglass that I'll be doing next. But when you're doing something that has this detailed pattern, this one, obviously I didn't make that mistake again. Well, you want to see that, don't you? So I think if I were to make this again, I probably, instead of using cream for this, I would have used one of my grays. Probably maybe the middle one, just so that you could actually see the quilting on that block. Obviously, this is being done now, so I'm leaving it the way it is. It is also only the second time I've done this. This was the first one. This is the second time I've done it. And so by using the cream, obviously, you can't see any of the mistakes that I, of course, did not make. It's absolutely perfect. Whereas if I used one of the high contrasting threads, you would have seen everything. So I suppose there's that benefit. But it really does it gets lost. What I'll be doing now, I will still continue using the cream. Now I'm going to start with the hourglass. I'm going to do the horizontal direction first. I'm going to start in the middle of the quilt just to get it, get the layers all attached together. And then I'll spread out from there. That is all the quilting finished. And if I just slowly come in, you can start to see the pattern that I chose, the hourglass pattern showing. Just going a bit of an angle, that might help. Oh, that made it really dark. Let's try and lighten that up a bit. There we go. And I've also taken another look at that initial pattern that I did in the center square here. I think I kind of like it now. I had been really worried before that the thread didn't show well enough. But when you look at it as an overall image, that section, that square is really flat because of the tight quilting compared to the quilting I've done elsewhere. And I think that makes it stand out. And you can see the quilting when you are up close. You can see the pattern. It's just subtle. And I think maybe for this particular quilt, if I had used a contrasting thread, something that stood out a bit more, it would have drawn your eye too much and been too much of a distraction. Whereas the overall impression of this quilt is something subtle. And so you wouldn't suddenly want to have a dark gray square there. Salsa's come to visit. Hi, Salsa. Now, in terms of the rest of the quilting, I think I am going to do that cross hatching where I will come in at an angle. I'll start there and I'll go through the points all the way down one side and then the same on the other side. That does mean that in a situation like this, I'm going to be stitching in the ditch and you're not going to see that I've done any quilting there. But then once I cross over into this square, you will see the stitching coming through this side. There certainly would be nothing wrong with me stopping my quilting process here and saying that I'm done, and it would be absolutely fine. But this is down to that design and style, and I would prefer to do another line of stitching. I do like dense quilting. I do like it when it's really tight, and I feel just one more line coming this way and one more line coming that way adds a little bit more quilting, and it will help with the corners. Actually, while I'm zoomed in on this corner, I've also noted with the hourglass pattern. So here's the hourglass pattern on this side. and then the hourglass pattern on this side. But in the middle, that then creates this lovely star image, which I really like. The problem is though, is that means this whole centerpiece right here isn't quilted. So what I'll be doing is I'll be coming in and putting a line through there and a line through there. Obviously, I'll have to move the pins as I go along, but that is just fine. And then we'll be done. So cross hatching each way throughout the whole quilt, and then the quilting will be finished. The quilting's all finished, which means my next step is to square off my piece before I can put the binding on. Fortunately, this is such a small quilt that I'm able to fit it on top of my table. Obviously, if I was doing something larger than this, then there'd be a floor situation happening as I tried to square it off. You would have seen that as I was getting ready for this, that I made sure I had my mat just under the side that I will be cutting first, which will obviously be this side. And then in terms of the rulers, the reason why I've put out so many is to square off your quilt. You want to make sure you've got those squared off corners. So yes, I will be cutting this side first to get my sort of baseline for the rest of the quilt, and it is the bottom of the quilt, so that if anything goes wrong, it's down at the bottom. But nothing will go wrong, it'll be fine. The reason why I've then put these extra rulers coming up the side is because to decide on my bottom position, I'm also going to be looking at this point to make sure that is also straight going up the side of my quilts. And it will help to get me that, especially using a square ruler, will help to get me that squared corner. The other thing I will be mindful of is I'm right-handed. So for me, left hand on ruler, right hand cutting in front of me. And I will make sure that I do that all the way around, which means I either need to move or the quilt needs to move. What you don't want to do is be holding the ruler like this and coming up the side, because it's not a smooth motion to be making, and that's where you can end up going off somewhere or your hand can shift. So I'm either going to have to move the cutting mat to be up the side, so that way I can then cut straight, or I'm going to have to turn the quilt around. Given its size, I'll probably move the cutting mat and then work my way along. Okay, let's get the quilt squared up and then I can put the binding on. Okay, that is the squaring up finished, the cutting all done. So I can put this to the side. The next step for this quilt is binding it. And I picked up this fabric at the same time that I picked up the backing from Ye Olde Fabric Shop in Stratford. The Stratford in Canada, not the Stratford in England. I didn't fly that far for backing fabric. And again, the same as with the backing fabric. It's all about personal preference. I could have gone gray, I could have gone orange, I could have gone yellow, I could have done something completely different, in a white or a black, anything like that. I chose this color. Obviously this is not a fine science, I'm just giving you an idea here, because I felt it worked with the fabrics I had on the front, but it also, I feel, works with the fabric I chose for the back. So I will be cutting this into 2.5-inch strips, sewing all the strips together so I end up with a long line of fabric, and then I will stitch it all around the quilt. I will stitch it to the back first and then fold over to the front. And although I can hand stitch the binding down, I am an incredibly slow hand stitcher. I know there's the trend now for slow stitching, but there's slow stitching and then there's me. What's slower than slow stitching? Me. So when I do my binding, not only will I sew it to the back and then flip it to the front, once it's folded over onto the front, I will then also sew it from the front as well. Otherwise, she will never get this quilt because I will never finish hand sewing. All right, binding next, and then we're done. I've sewn the binding onto the back of the quilt. And now I'm at the stage where I can fold it over so that it comes to the front of the quilt. As I said before, I like to use stitching, as in the sewing machine, rather than hand sewing. And I'm fortunate enough with my Juki that I have, just focusing on it, there we go, quite a few different styles of stitching that I can use on my machine, and all I would mean I'd have to do is change the foot that I'm using, and then I use these codes on the computer screen to tell the machine which row I'm looking at, and then I key in the number to tell it which pattern that I'd like to use. So what I've done is experimented with a few different designs from the machine. And just a note here, let me just get this all flattened out. There we go. When I'm experimenting with designs, I use the same thickness as the quilt that I'm working on. Because if I had just stuck this extra bit of binding fabric through my machine, it's so flimsy, it would have changed the way the stitching looked. So I also grabbed some of the batting and backing that I had cut off of the quilt when I had squared it up earlier and used that. And I experimented, let me see, there we go, with a few of the different stitches from my machine to see which one I thought would work best for this particular quilt. I ended up going with this first one, actually. Isn't that always the way? The first one that you try is the one you go with. I chose that one because I felt it coordinated well with the stitching that I was already using for the for quilting the quilt. And I have already completed one side, way down here. Let me just focus in on that for you. So that's what it looks like on the front. And there we go. You can see it through on the back. So I've got my next side ready to quilt. I'll just show you what that looks like. There we go. So if I just take out this pin, where am I? There we are. So it's stitched on the back just with a straight stitch. And I'm folding it forwards onto the front. And what I'm looking for when I fold it is, just focus that in, this straight line of stitching right here. I want to make sure that when I fold it over, I'm right on that line of stitching. First of all, to cover it, I don't want it showing, but because I'm using this sewing machine to stitch my binding rather than hand sewing, if I line it up correctly, then I'll make sure that I don't accidentally go onto my backing fabric, that I stay on the binding. There was a little bit in the corner here, I got close. I got a little bit close in the corner where it went off, which is fine. What I don't want to see, the camera's having problems focusing, hold on. What I don't want to see is that I've misaligned it so much when I folded it over to the front that my stitching has ended up way over here. I don't want to see that. And the only way to prevent that when I'm folding it is to make sure that I line up the edge of my fold with that stitching line. Because that is necessary, I do also go down and use quite a few pins in my work to keep the binding in place. It also stops it from stretching and ending up with a bunch of fabric down at the other end. And then obviously, as you're folding, making sure, focus camera. Oh dear, let's try this. There we go. Making sure you end up with a nice mitered corner, which is where the fabric is folding here. So I'm going to go around and continue using this stitching that I've chosen to attach my binding, and then it is finished. There's the quilt all finished. And it took me long enough to complete this quilt that I was actually able to attend my most recent guild meeting and bring the quilt with me. I did that for two reasons. Obviously, we have a show and share at our quilt meetings, and I wanted to show and share the quilt, but I also wanted to get their input on the quilting patterns that I had chosen to use, specifically that center block. Because of the light cream thread I chose, you really can't see that detail until you're closer. Earlier in the video, I said I wasn't too happy with it because I couldn't see it. Then, once I had completed the rest of the quilting, I changed my mind and decided actually I did like it because of the subtle effect that it gave. I've bounced back again. I'm thinking, oh, maybe it should have been a colored thread. So I took it to the guild meeting, showed the members, explained to them what I had done and why, and asked them what their thoughts were. Now, our guild is fairly large. We have about 100 members. I don't know offhand whether or not all 100 of them were there that night, but it was a fairly full room. And I'd say the room was sort of split in half. There was a good portion that loved it just the way it was. Then I had some who said that they think they might have preferred a colored thread. In the video, I had thought I might use a gray, but they suggested using a variegated orange, or maybe more of a yellow, just so that there was a little bit of color there. So this is where it really does come down to personal preference. And I suppose as I go through this process and I quilt more and more frequently, I'll be able to pick out my personal preference prior to doing the quilting, because obviously in this situation, although it would be possible for me to unpick that square and change the color of the thread, that's a lot of work. And I don't think I would have done that anyway. I did want to show two things to you. This was the book that I had been using to help with my quilting. I'd said before that I'm more confident using my walking foot than I am my free motion foot. Earlier in the video, I think I pronounced her name incorrectly. It's Melissa Marginet, and she has a whole YouTube online presence, so I'll link her below. And this is her first book, Edge to Edge Walking Foot Quilting Designs, and I used this book to help me with the hourglass pattern that I used on most of the quilt. For this center block, somebody at my guild had an example. We had like a back to basics teaching you how to do different things. And she was showing us how to do binding on a quilt that had this pattern. And so I was talking to her about it and asking her, and then came home and decided to try and use it. I shared that at the guild when I went to the most recent meeting, that's what I had done in the center. And we have a library section to our guild meetings, and the librarian came running over to me afterwards because our library has Melissa Marginet's second book, I did not know that, Walking Foot Quilting Designs, and inside this book is that second pattern that I chose. So it's called, her basic pattern is called the Vortex, and when I turned it to make this, she calls it 4 Vortex alternating clockwise and counterclockwise. She does have one that is 4 clockwise vortex that's not alternating. So in a minute I'll move the camera so I can zoom in on this page and you can see more clearly what I did. But I'm so excited about having this book. I've loaned it from our guild library, and I took a flip through it on the drive home from the guild meeting. I wasn't driving. There are so many patterns in here that are just, they're so simple because you're making them with a walking foot, and you just ping around your square or your block, but they end up being such complicated designs, or at least they look like they are. So I'm really excited to have this book now and use it for quilting some of the other quilts that I have available. The only thing I have left to do with this quilt, I guess, is to get it packaged up and ready to ship over to England in time for my friend to have her baby. And then this project is all finished. If you've enjoyed watching me make this quilt and like to see some of the other projects that I'm working on in the coming weeks, you know what to do. Hit that like, subscribe, and bell notification. Bye.